Are you out there? I hear you. I see you. Okay, quick question for you. For starters, how many of you are killing it? Like hashtag nailed it with peace. Like you're just carrying peace everywhere you go. Come on, I was just wanting someone to come up here and teach for me, right? How many of you are hashtag killing it in stress? Like you know what stress feels like. That's something you have got an A+ in, okay? All right, so we're here to talk about that today. Did you know in society, 77% of everyone, male and female, say that they are now experiencing physical symptoms of stress? We've gone from kind of this, I feel stressed because I'm overscheduled and I have a lot going on, but now the physical symptoms of that start to take us on this continuum with mental health. All of a sudden, stress becomes like tightness of chest or labored breathing or sleepless nights or a racing mind. Anyone? Okay, as of this morning, a study came out that said 1 in 5 Americans believe that they have an undiagnosed anxiety disorder. And guess what the number one trigger is? Work. So I thought, well, why not talk about that today at an entrepreneurial conference, right? We can still be people of God, sons and daughters of God. Jesus says, I give you my peace I give with you. The peace I give, the world cannot give, so don't be troubled or afraid. So then why are we, even people of God, knowing that Jesus is our peace, why are we still walking in stress? Why are we still feeling these weights of anxiety? I'm going to start real quick with my family because I'll get ahead of myself. Okay, so Gabe is my husband over there. We always smile like that every day. We've never fought once in our life. We've been married 22 years, so we do have offspring. So we've got Cade, who's 18, then Pierce, who's tall like Gabe, Kennedy, who's the boss of all of us. She's 14. Do you have any one of those in your family? And then we've got Joy, our newest addition we brought home from China several months ago. So Cade and Joy are our Down syndrome bookends, and they keep us on our toes. So that's my family, and as you can imagine, when Cade was born, when I was 26, I found out 6 hours after he was born that the doctor said, we see signs of Down syndrome in your baby. And it was actually an emergency C-section, and he hadn't grown the last trimester, and it was a failure to thrive moment. And all of a sudden, that really began a stressful season for me. I remember early on, his first 2 years, Down syndrome airways are smaller, and so when they swell, all of a sudden that smothering can happen quick. So he would get croup, and then all that stridor, like that labored breathing would happen, and Gabe and I would rush to the hospital night after night. And then Cade was also a runner. Do you have kids that just run off? Like we had to get the mall security to help me find him and dancing in the back of Hollister one time. Back in, I had 2 others that were 3 and 5, and here's Cade. And then I'll never forget. We're at a water park, and he disappears, and he basically had gone down the major slide called Leap of Faith 5 times, cutting everyone else in line, while all the lifeguards are helping me try to find my son that's roaming around the park. Well, 9 years later into that time, we moved to New York City. Gabe thought it would be awesome to move 3 kids, 2 toy poodles, and a minivan into the midtown of Manhattan, which is not cool anywhere, but particularly in that season when you're going that direction. And Kennedy is starting kindergarten, so I'm thinking, like, this is a midlife reset. I'm going to find meaning, like, who was Rebekah before diapers and Cheerios and poop? I'm trying to remember, trying to recall that part of me. So I started taking night classes at Parsons School of Design down in Union Square. And so I was 30, and everyone else was, half my age. But I thought in that season I was going to find meaning, but instead I find surrender. And I can tell you today that meaning always follows surrender. We want a life of meaning, but we always have to yield the life we're currently living if we want that to intersect. And so 4 months into my time in New York City, I have a panic attack. My very first one on a flight from Atlanta back to LaGuardia. Almost midnight, turbulence hits. Everyone's doubling down on their seatbelt, but not me. No, I'm in the back of the plane starting this St. Elmo's fire run to the front of the galley where the sweet flight attendant's on the little, jump seat, like, no. And I'm like, move, right? Because one of us was going to win. And I remember falling right there in the fetal, collapsed right there, and I just kept saying, panic, panic, panic. And what began that day continued on planes, trains, elevators, subways, and crowds. Has anyone ever been to New York City? Right? I was like, well, wonderful timing, Lord. And so this continues for a year, and I'll never forget about a year in just crying out to God. And went from just tight spaces that was rooted in claustrophobia, and then it kind of evolved into, waking up in my bed or going to the park or the playground. I was just always had this smothering sense. Turns out there was some PTSD from the day Cade was born, 9 years prior. And then New York was a pressure cooker that just pushed everything to the surface for me. I had never had any history of anxiety. I do remember watching my father have his first mental breakdown when I was 19. And then when I went off to college, he spent a year in a psychiatric hospital. And he just passed a year ago. And even then, my mom gave me his study Bible, where he used to be a pastor before I was even born. And I opened the inside flap, and it said depression stoppers. And all these things were listed out in the way God would use his word to equip my father in his faith, even while he was walking through hard things. Because we walk through a valley of a shadow of death, right? We don't camp there, make our home there, pitch a tent there. We know we're walking through something. And Winston Churchill even says, if you're walking through hell, keep going. Eventually, the darkness will lift. And so a year into this journey for me, I'll never forget, I wake in the middle of the night and heart's pounding out of my chest like so many times before. How many of you have had a panic attack? Okay. So there's so many different expressions of this, but for most of us, what that looks like is it's irrational. Our bodies are responding as if we are being held at gunpoint. Hearts beating out of our chest. We feel like we're dying. We might be having a heart attack. We go to the hospital or we go to the doctor and what's going on. But it's irrational. It's our body is basically can no longer contain the inner emotional strain that we have been carrying. And so it's just like, time out, I'm done. And so that night, it came to a head, and I remember just finding my words in the middle of my husband praying for me, and I just said, rescue me, deliver me, I cannot do it without you. This prayer of just surrender, like, do what only you can do. And in that moment, I'm flooded with peace. For the first time, I didn't have to run from that situation. That fight or flight response had just subdued, and I was just laying there in the dark. All was still, nothing moving but my eyeballs back and forth. And there might be a name for this in Pentecostal circles, but this Baptist girl has no idea what is happening. So I'm just laying there. And I remember stepping out of my apartment the next day like, we're going rogue. Like, I don't even know what's happening. It's just going to keep going. Because I still have to get on subways, and I still have to get on elevators. And before, I would just take 9 flights of stairs if I could avoid an elevator that had too many people, or I would just walk that extra mile in New York. Did a lot of walking in New York. But I didn't have another panic attack for 7 years. And what I learned in that season is that I started studying mental health, and I studied it in the church, and I especially studied it just as a society and how mainstream this conversation has now become. And so I will never forget coming back into the city after about 3 months of just this reprieve. And having to take a train to LaGuardia, or to Queens. And it was, again, as I'm descending underground, flight by flight by flight, that muscle memory wants to come back. And I'll never forget being on that train that day after this peace moment and not a panic attack, but still feeling that residual, the debris of fear. See, anxiety had become my fancy word for fear. And while I had experienced the peace of Christ coming under his covering of peace, the problem with relapse is that you believe that you'll never change, and despair can settle in. And I remember going down underground, and in that flight, on that train that day, there's just me. It's like not rush hour. It's later in the day. I choose a time when there's not a lot of people. I think there's like a 70-year-old man and me, and I'm like, Jesus, 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 Jesus. It's cool, it's cool. You want to hold my hand? It'll be fine. I know we'll never see each other again, but it was one of those moments like, we're going to get through this. And I came back up to the surface of the city that day on the street level, and I said, God, we need a game plan. Like, I need to make a plan, and I need to work a plan. How many of you guys are like that? You're entrepreneurs. Like, give me a field guide for fear. And so over the course of the last 7 years, God has shown me through his word, through his created order in the world, that there are 4 rhythms for our emotional and spiritual and relational health. Sustained emotional, spiritual, and relational health. See, society can be spiraling in one direction, but if we claim a faith in God who is at the helm and a peace that Jesus gives, then somehow we have to make sense of what our bodies want to do in response with, and all the things that are coming at us, and then also look at the rhythm that God created in order, in creation. So God created in rhythm, days and nights, evening and morning, sun, moon, stars, and then all of a sudden he creates everything from seasons to weeks to months to years. And then ultimately the culmination of his creation is humanity, right? So then even with our bodies, we operate in rhythm within the rhythm of creation. We have heartbeat and pulse, breathing, labor pains, contractions, everything operates in rhythm. And so when God creates order in rhythm, when we stay within those boundaries, we are governed by peace. But when we get out of the constraints of rhythm, all of a sudden chaos ensues, and our minds pay the price, and our bodies pay the price, and ultimately our friends and our families pay the price, and our work and our purpose and our passions pay the price. So what are these 4 rhythms? Rest, restore, connect, create. I'm just giving them to you right now. If you can write this down: rest, restore, connect, create. 4 simple rhythms for sustained emotional, spiritual, relational, and vocational health. So rest and restore are input rhythms. I like alliteration. I was called Becca Book in 4th grade. I read 62 Nancy Drew books. I'm like just kind of nerding out on words. And readers make writers, apparently, so now that's what I do. So rest and restore. Rest is the inner life, your spiritual life. It's this idea that we have to get quiet, we have to examine and confess, we have to have a morning routine, routines for deep sleep. We have to take an actual Sabbath. It's not optional to God. Rest is not optional to God. In fact, at the end of creation, he rests, and then he blesses that day. Rest precedes blessing. You don't run to earn rest. You run fueled from a posture of rest. It's not like you work, and then you just collapse on Saturday. No, you are filled on a Sabbath so that you go back out from an overflow and an abundance. And so what's happening in culture is that we have so many doing the output rhythms, but they never are replenished. So you burn out. God even commanded that the land would rest every 7 years for his people. Guess what? They did not obey. So after 70 cycles of 7, 490 years later, God exiles his people from the land for the 70 years so it can rest. We think it's just a punishment. No, it's also this culmination of God going, I mean what I say, and I say what I mean. And when I ask you to rest, it's because I've created an order that I am God and I rest. I certainly would expect that you would do the same. You're not God. And so they had to leave the land, and the land was able to rest. And I look at us in our work and in our vocation, and sometimes we're like, I can't afford a Sabbath. Well, what could happen is 7 years later, you burn out and you're unproductive anyway. You actually have lost the passion for the thing that got you going in the first place because rest was always seen as something you didn't have permission to do. Because the lie of society is that we don't need a circadian rhythm anymore. We can just operate in a digital revolution with a body that never has to stop. But the problem is a sunrise gives you blue light to tell you to wake up. Not a phone light, blue light, but a sunrise. God actually gives blue light that emits from a sunrise to tell our bodies to wake up. And guess what's in a sunset? A sunset emits red light, natural melatonin for our body to tell us to go to sleep. And so we're wondering why we're so strung out. We feel physical symptoms of stress. He's like, because I created, even in my nature, when you get outside, I've given you all the things. So rest is all about the baseline for health. Sleep is a superpower. There's a TED Talk about it. Like, if we cannot stop a racing mind, then we'll never get a chance to sleep. And your brain gets to be the boss of your body. So whatever reserves you got last night on 3 hours of sleep, your mind gets it first. And your mind's like, keeps going and going and going. And your body's like, I cannot keep up with the mind that won't quit. So part of rest leads us into restoration, restore. Restore is our physical health. Eat something that grows on a plant, not made in a plant. All of a sudden, we've got not just a sunset to walk that's free that God offers us to rest. We've got grounds and gardening and plants and vegetables and fruits that actually grow that are for our good. We could be fueled on caffeine and sugar, but that's actually not going to get us where we want to go, and it's not going to sustain us. So what do we eat? And then are we moving? Scholars believe that Jesus walked 3,300 miles in his 3 years of ministry based on all the places that he went. Because when he said, follow me, he meant, no, literally, like walk with me. There's not an Uber anywhere nearby. Like, walk, take the movement. All of a sudden, we see that when we move, I was just going to show you a couple examples. There's a book that inspired me. It talked about walking, and it says, the average person spends 9.3 hours sitting per day, far more than the 7 hours we spend sleeping. And this inactivity creates a set of cascading issues that can undermine our other attempts to get out of our funk. Not only does the lack of exercise make us more susceptible to heart disease or diabetes or other ailments that come from a lethargic lifestyle, it shuts down our brains and limits our growth. You might be surprised to know that several of the most innovative people in modern history saw walking as essential to their daily rhythm. From Steve Jobs to Sigmund Freud, walking was a way they carried on meetings and processed their best thinking and advice. Even in the 1800s, Charles Dickens walked almost 20 miles every day to de-stress and free his mind to come back fresh for composition. I love that Charles Dickens calls writing composition. I'm gonna steal that. In fact, because it has been determined that walking helps us think better, Google has incorporated walking meetings into its workday. Employees can reserve the time they want to meet on an indoor walking track. When I was studying and writing this book, I found out someone had a treadmill desk, and I was like, I wonder. So then all of a sudden, I come home one day about a month into the book, and Gabe has Nancy the Nordic tracks just set up for me upstairs. And I was like, okay, I'm going to try to do this. I'm going to try to write, and I'm going to try to walk. And turns out, don't walk too fast while you're trying to write, or you'll feel like you need to throw up. I don't know how many of you have, motion sickness. I grew up as a kid able to read in a car, and it didn't bother me one bit. All the roller coasters were awesome. When you're 40, then all of a sudden you're just like, okay, maybe just keep that speed down a little bit. But the point is this, that we have to move. We have to move our bodies. So rest and restore. Spiritual health, physical health. The last two are connect and create. Connect is relational health. This is a big one. 46% of society believes they don't have a real friend, and they are experiencing high feelings of loneliness. And so loneliness leads to depression, and part of it is 18 to 24-year-olds are the first generation raised in social media ubiquity, which basically means they are omnipresent, right? They are everywhere. They can see everything at all times, and they can talk to everyone but connect with no one. All of a sudden, you just picture someone like in a dark room in a house with no lights on, and there's just this glow off their face, and they are somehow living. And so we have lost this sense of what humanity means because everything is transactional, and it's all filtered and edited, and there is no actual vulnerability happening. See, transparency is sharing where you've been, but vulnerability is sharing where you are. And we have to be able to make physical contact with someone where we are able to say, I'm not okay. Oh, you aren't either. Maybe we're better together. Maybe we can lead with vulnerability. So chapters in this section are all very much about apologizing first and leading with vulnerability and conflict resolution. It's about intimacy and communion and hospitality and welcoming someone in. This is how the church began. This is how the church became viral, is that they would welcome in their homes and they would break bread with one another. And it wasn't perfect. Just throw some stuff. They probably had charcuterie boards back then. They probably just threw olives and cheese on everything. I don't know. But the point is, it doesn't have to be all buttoned up. It's a communal gathering because we were made for communion. There's a triune God who created us as beings to need each other because we are made in his image, and we are not complete without that intimacy and communion with one another. And so we've got to take connect seriously. Did you know that the science of a hug raises dopamine levels in your body? 5 seconds. So Cade, my oldest, Down syndrome, in New York City, he didn't really have social barriers. There's no such thing as personal space. He'd get on the subway and smush his way in between two women where there's 6 inches, quite not enough for his butt, but he didn't really care. He was just like, hi. And then by the end, everyone's laughing because they're okay with it because Cade's Cade. But one thing I noticed is when you get on on an elevator, some tall dude that looks like he plays for the NBA, he just wants to hug him, and Cade's this tall. And the guy's awkward, and he's like, Okay, and then Cade wants to linger, like he's a flirt. So if there's a girl in here and she's cute, he'll be like, want to linger, and we'll go, okay, that's okay. I know it's raising dopamine levels for both of you, but we need to stop right now, okay? But there's a point here. There's a point here that physical contact is important. Dopamine is connected with our ability to feel connected and bonded. Women, mothers give this through breast milk. There's an attachment. There's a connection that forges that. A sense of belonging occurs. How many of us feel like we need that? We need that in our families. We need to give that to our children. We need to give that to our society. Because all of a sudden we have all these isolated people operating basically with all the AI coming at them that have lost what it means to be human. And finally, create. Create is all about our vocational health. It's why so many of you are motivated to be here today. It's the work of your hands. Your calling is where your talents and your burdens collide. Talents are these birthright gifts that God put in you and established in the womb. In Psalm 139, he says, "My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. My eyes saw my unformed body, and all my days were written in your book and planned before one of them began." See, God calls out destiny over his sons and daughters. A father is the only one who can call out destiny over a son or a daughter. And not only does he call out destiny and has a vision for your life and a plan and purpose, he's not going to coerce or force you to do that. But what he will do is instill, when he knits you, all the very things that you will need to walk that destiny out. Parker Palmer wrote a book called Let Your Life Speak. It came out in the year 2000. I was about a decade late to the party reading this book. And he said, we all come into this world with birthright gifts. And early on, we abandon them. Or others discourage or disabuse them. But if we are aware and awake and able to admit our loss, we'll spend the second half of our lives recovering the gifts we've always possessed. And that's what it looks like for so many of us. Stepping into the gifts, stepping into the burden. See, birthright gifts, the world knows birthright gifts. They operate in their gifting. But what makes a believer look different than the world is that we actually know what our burdens are as well. It's not just what we do, but why. So burdens is always informed by the family you were born into, the story you've walked, the journey you've lived. It's the thing that broke your heart. It's the thing that keeps you up at night. And for me, I'll never forget when I watched my father have that episode, and then all of a sudden my firstborn son has an IQ in the 40s. I knew that my burden, the things that keep me up at night, the things that make my heart weep, is mental illness. And if I need to use calling, if I need to use birthright gifts of writing or communication, I've always been a chronic oversharer, and God just decided to give me a story I can't shut up about. So he's like, well, we might as well use that for good, right? Use things for good to them who are called according to his purpose. Every single one of you are here today because there is some pain that you probably have walked through that is becoming purpose. There's something that propels you and drives you to make a difference and a shift in the world that you are walking in. That passion, the root word of passion means to suffer. So the more passion that you carry is informed by the things that break your heart. And God, when he breathes on those things, he propels them. See, the call of God is never possible without the move of God. And so today we come because we say, God, we trust that you have given us what we need to push back the dark. In our sphere of society, in our sphere of influence, you show us what we need to make a difference in the world. Amen? All right, so if you don't mind standing, I know you've been sitting for a while. We've got 1 minute and 19 seconds. So if you guys do one of these, a side hug, I know it's awkward. You might not know the person, but you know what? Your dopamine levels are going to raise. So come on, side hug it up. Side hug it up, right? So good. So good. You guys feel connected. You feel like you're one. I love it. I did this the other night with 6,000 college students. A lot of them were guys, and they're like, hey, bro, you know what? You see, Jesus' final prayer, I call it the great commencement speech of Jesus in John 12 through 17, right? His final prayer was that the future believers would be one, so that the world would know God's love for him and his love for us. And here's what I picture, a whole bunch of entrepreneurs going out in the world, and the world looking in from the outside of these walls going, I could be a part of that. I could belong to something like that. I could feel connected to a people like that. See, everyone out there, no matter what stress or anxiety, depression, panic disorder, they are all looking for a way home. And they are all looking for a people to call home. And we, as God's holy people who he loves, whose eyes roam the earth looking for whose hearts are completely his, says, you're mine. And I'm going to put my spirit in you, and you're going to reply, Abba, Father, yes, I am yours. And in that connection, in that belonging, in that spirit of adoption that brings us freedom, all of a sudden we have something to carry to a world. We have a hope, we have a truth, we have a faith. And even when we feel the tension rise that from the outside coming in, right? So stress is indicated by the outside factors coming in. Anxiety is inward going out. Even when we feel the temptation to fear, God says, I will always make a way of escape that you may be able to bear it. And as you bear it, you will walk out. Your faith will be tested and grow. You will be carriers of light shining in your hearts, right? Fragile clay jars cracked, but you carry my light, and the glory of God will rest on your head, and you'll be able to minister from a place of healing, a healing journey that falls within the constraints of these rhythms that invite you to commune with a loving God. Thank you.